From my home state swamps to scorching hot deserts, there are hundreds of different snake species, and all of them pretty much want to stay out of your way. But sometimes they run into conflicts with people. Since over 90% of our snake species are totally harmless, this isn't really a big issue. But out of all of the snake species that you can encounter, how many of them are actually deadly? I've been lucky enough to work with some of the deadliest snakes in America over the last few years. A lot of them are way less dangerous than most people think, and some of them just might be a bit more. Hey guys, I'm Zachary Gray, and today we're going to be ranking America's deadliest snakes. Now very recently, my friend Spencer made a video talking about the worst snake bites in the US. But we're not just going to be looking at bites and venom strength here. We'll be looking at how often people get bit, and looking at actual fatality records to figure out which snakes warrant the most caution. And I bet a couple of these might surprise y'all. Starting off our tier list, we have F tier. These snakes not only aren't venomous, but they don't even have the capability to bite. I'm starting off F tier with the blind snake. Whether it's our native Texas blind snakes out west, our invasive Brahminy blind snakes in the southeast, or the incredibly silly looking thread snakes. These tiny snakes are only really capable of biting the very small bugs that they eat. If you ever see one of these snakes, they're actually really mistakable for worms. If this was a bizarre animal list, these guys would definitely take the cake, but for us, they're going into the bottom of F tier. Next up, we have the small fossorial snake, and I've chosen the crown snake to represent the bunch. These snakes are tiny invertebrate eaters, but they pretty much never bite, even when they're stepped on or picked up. They're called fossorials because they spend all of their time living and digging underground, and can usually be found under old logs, small debris, and can oftentimes just be seen crawling through the leaf litter. There are also a lot of them: worm snakes, earth snakes, red-bellied snakes, pine woods litter snakes. But my favorite is definitely the crown snake, mostly because they eat centipedes. They're entirely harmless, they don't bite, so they're going into F tier. Although I am excluding one small fossorial snake from this category that we'll talk more about later. And at the top of our non-biting F tier, we have the mud snake. These giant aquatic snakes are incredibly elusive, they never bite, and they primarily feed on giant aquatic salamanders and other small amphibians. The reason that I'm putting them at the top of F tier is even though they don't bite, they actually stab you with their tail. These snakes have a small spine on the end of their tail that they typically use to pin down their prey with. And if you ever pick one of these snakes up, they'll actually stick you with it. Still not a bite, they're perfectly harmless, but they do at least have something pointy to defend themselves with, so I've decided to put them in the top of F tier just for fun. Moving up the list, we now have D tier. These snakes still aren't deadly just yet, and are overall considered to be non-venomous by human standards. They all actually have the capability to bite, but some of them have a little bit more than just teeth. So at the bottom of D tier, we have the small colubrid snakes, which will be represented by the rough green snake. Rough green snakes primarily feed on small, soft-bodied invertebrates, and they're genuinely some of the nicest snakes around. They don't look like any venomous snakes, and out of the hundreds of rough green snakes that I have caught, I have only ever had 2 of them bite me. And it genuinely felt like nothing happened at all. You could put many different snake species here: glossy snakes, scarlet snakes, even crawfish snakes. But I think rough green snakes are a great example of a small colubrid snake, and a perfect fit for the bottom of D tier. And moving up, we have the large colubrid snakes. These are snakes that you'll often see me getting bit by, and I've decided to make the gopher snake their representative. Coach whips, rat snakes, king snakes, there are all sorts of non-venomous colubrids that are very athletic and very capable of biting. Overall, these snakes are still harmless, but you probably still don't want to be bitten by them. I find that gopher snakes are some of the strongest and largest colubrids that people oftentimes encounter out in the Midwest. And if you were to pick one up and be tagged by it, it definitely does not feel great. Also, shout out to that racer snake that one time bit me right on the face. He gets honorary top of D tier, but the rest of them, bottom of D tier. Next up, we have the water snakes, and these guys are grumpy. Overall, they're on par with other large colubrids, but they actually have an anticoagulant in their saliva, which basically means that if you get tagged by a large water snake, you're gonna bleed for quite some time. Now, the reason that they have this is mostly for hunting fish and frogs, and it's believed to be a part of predigestion. I get bit by these snakes all the time, and I've never heard of one being medically significant, but it's definitely a worse bite than your average colubrid, so they're being put right in the middle of D tier. Now at the top of D tier, we're getting into some snakes that have some little tricks. And first up, we have the ringneck snake. This is that little fossorial snake that I left out earlier. These snakes have a bit more to their bite than their relatives down in F tier, because they're actually a small, rear-fanged, venomous snake, producing a toxin using what's called Duvernoy's venom gland. There is a really good argument that this really doesn't matter, and that other larger snake bites are worse. However, the regal ringneck snake found in the American Southwest is quite large, and I would not recommend taking a bite from one of these snakes. Another species with the same venom gland is the lyre snake, which can also be found out in the American Southwest. They get a lot bigger than ringneck snakes, and while they aren't defensive when they're messed with, they still have been known to give a pretty decent bite. Moving on up now, we have the hognose snake. These snakes are famous for their over-the-top defensive displays. If you ever mess with one of these snakes, they'll flatten their head out like a cobra, hiss loud, and sometimes even strike. Funny enough, most of these strikes are going to be bluff strikes. But if they do bite, they actually have massive rear fangs. The reason they have these giant fangs is actually for eating toads, because sometimes toads will puff up with air to make it to where a predator can't swallow them. These giant toad poppers also have the added effect of delivering a slightly worse bite than our previous rear fang snakes. Here's where I start branching out a little bit, because I personally put garter snakes well above ringnecks and hognose snakes. Garter snakes have in fact hospitalized people on incredibly rare occasions, and in my opinion, garter snake bites absolutely suck. They have those same big rear fangs that hognose snakes do, and when they're disturbed, they're a lot more defensive. And while extreme garter snake bites are very few and far between, it's definitely enough to put them in the top of D tier. Alright, now moving on to C tier, these snakes are either incredibly rare, rarely bite, or their damages, however bad they may be, have never led to a human fatality. In short, you're more likely to be struck by lightning while fighting a shark than die to one of these snakes. First up, we have a snake that many of you might not have even thought was in the US, and is one of the rarest snakes that you will probably never get to see in person, the yellow-bellied sea snake. These snakes are fully aquatic and spend their entire life living in the ocean. And because of this, they have an incredibly toxic venom for hunting down fish. The only place you can encounter one of these animals in the US is actually in Hawaii, where they do naturally occur, but even there, sightings are so rare that they oftentimes make the news. On very rare occasion, these snakes can also wash up on the southern coast of California. They're not something to worry about as a beach day hazard, and they're probably one of the most well-mannered snakes around. The only time there's ever been deaths from these snakes, it's when people have handled them when they've been caught in fishing nets or they were washed up on the beach, where this animal is most likely dying. Still, because these animals are almost never encountered, bites are virtually non-existent, and there's never been a death in the US from one of these snakes, the highest I can put these animals is the bottom of C tier. Next up, we have the highest ranking non-venomous snake, the Burmese python. While Burmese pythons aren't native to the United States, these snakes are so well established in the Everglades that they deserve a spot on this list. These snakes are some of the largest in the world, right behind reticulated pythons and anacondas. And they're a huge threat to the Everglades ecosystem, taking down birds, mammals, and even crocodilians. There's never been a recorded human fatality from one of these snakes, but their bites can be nasty. When bites from this snake do occur, it's almost always a handler or somebody trying to capture and remove the snake. And yeah, a bite from a 12-foot python is no fun. So while they're not medically significant in the venomous sense, they definitely earn their place on this list with physical damage. So they're going into C tier. Finally, a very interesting little group of snakes to end C tier with are the montane rattlesnakes. While these mini rattlesnakes are venomous, their bite has never led to a human fatality. This is going to be the rock, ridge-nose, and twin-spotted rattlesnakes. These mini rattlesnake species are incredibly small and elusive, and are mostly living in very remote locations where there's just not a lot of people around. Of the three, rock rattlesnakes are definitely the most common, and they have sent a few people to the hospital. In fact, I personally know 5 people that have been bit by these snakes. Now, the ridge-nosed rattlesnake is actually an endangered species, and I have a massive respect for all the people that work with these animals. Because of their endangered status, they've only ever bitten researchers, people working with species recovery, or poachers. And once again, there's never been a death from one of these snakes. Honestly, I couldn't even find a record of a twin-spotted bite because they're so rare. And it's believed that their venom is quite mild. Definitely no deaths from these snakes, not ones to get bit by, but they are by no means deadly. So they go into the top of C tier. Alright, now that we're getting into B tier, we're dealing with snakes that have directly attributed to an odd human fatality. Even still, these snakes are a bit more notorious than I think they should be, and deaths are very few and far between. At the bottom of B tier, we have the pygmy and Massasauga rattlesnakes. As their name suggests, these snakes are quite small, so they're very easy to step on or accidentally put your hand next to while hiking, which is how the majority of people are actually bitten by these snakes. Despite this, their venom is incredibly mild, and they don't have a lot of it. I was able to confirm at least 3 separate deaths from these snakes over the last 100 years, 2 of which were from Massasaugas, and 1 of which was from a dusky pygmy. Overall, if you're healthy and you don't have any pre-consisting medical conditions, these snakes are very unlikely to give you a lethal bite. My best advice is if you're ever heading out into Massasauga or pygmy territory, just wear decent shoes or boots, and your chances of getting bit by this snake are almost non-existent. Finally, for one of the most misunderstood of the bunch, we have the coral snakes. These guys are extremely venomous with a neurotoxic venom that can cause real issues if envenomation occurs. Now, these snakes are actually tied with the most venomous snakes on this list for venom fatality rate. So you might think that I'm nuts putting them this low. But here's the trick. They have really tiny mouths and they almost never bite. You'd pretty much have to force one of these snakes to bite you. Bites are incredibly rare, and deaths are even rarer, with only 2 known fatalities over the last 60 years. Not only that, but out of the 3 coral snake species we have, the Sonoran, the Texas, and the Eastern, only the Eastern coral snake bites have been proven to be fatal. Not to say that these guys aren't also incredibly toxic. People just don't get bit by them. That being said, coral snake venom is no joke. They've got a super strong neurotoxic venom, meaning it really affects the nervous system, breathing, and muscle control. So while the risk of taking a bite from one of these snakes is close to non-existent, if you ever do get envenomated, it can easily lead to death without medical intervention. 2 deaths in 60 years is not enough for me to put these snakes higher than B tier. Something tells me that one's gonna get me in trouble. So, rattlesnakes. There's a lot of them, and a lot of them are going right here in B tier. All of these rattlesnakes have potentially deadly venom, but due to their shy nature, their rarity, and much more treatable bites, they have caused very few to no deaths. That being said, these snakes still deserve a lot of respect and some distance. Starting off, we have black-tailed rattlesnakes. These get to a pretty decent size, pack some nice venom, but they're just some of the chillest rattlesnakes around. They're actually one of my favorites in the Southwest, and they rarely ever strike. Great Basin and Grand Canyon rattlesnakes, 2 western rattlesnake species that just don't encounter people too often, meaning there's just not a lot of chance for bites. Arizona black rattlesnakes, another favorite of mine, capable of changing colors when disturbed and are typically very fond of mountainous regions. Despite looking very menacing and being a little bit spunky, they're ultimately a very shy and reclusive species, and for that reason, they just don't bite people that often. Next up are 2 of the most toxic rattlesnake species in the world, the tiger and the midget-faded rattlesnake. Despite having very similar LD50s, otherwise known as lethal doses, these snakes have never directly caused a human fatality. I was actually very surprised with how few tiger rattlesnake bites have actually ever been recorded. But the midget-faded rattlesnake is another western rattlesnake species that you're very unlikely to encounter. And finally, to end off this category, I'm putting the prairie rattlesnake. Probably one of the most widespread rattlesnakes in the US. While their venom isn't near as potent as some of these other snakes, their bites are frequent enough that there have actually been a couple of deaths from these snakes. There are so many rattlesnakes that I could put into this category, but being as there are over 50 rattlesnake species, I definitely think rattlesnakes deserve their own video in the future. And while we do have a lot more notable rattlesnakes on this list, you can rest assured that if I don't mention them in this video directly, they're probably being put into this category right here in B tier. And finally, in the top of B tier, we have a snake that got a lot higher than I thought it would, and that's the copperhead. These small, unassuming pit vipers make up almost half of the total venomous snake bites in America, with more hospitalizations than any other snake in the country. However, they also have the weakest venom of any snake in the US. That being said, I personally know at least 6 people that have been bitten by copperheads, so it's clear that their bites are pretty frequent. A few of the deaths that I read about were quite avoidable, and only became serious due to a lack of medical intervention or allergic reaction. Since these snakes are so widespread, incredibly camouflaged, and are a nice medium-sized pit viper, this is definitely the snake to keep your eyes peeled for while you're out hiking. Most copperhead bites have happened when the snake is stepped on or somebody accidentally puts their hand right next to it without seeing it. In total, I was able to find 6 recorded fatalities over the last 100 years. Now, to give a comparison, just in the US alone, at least 60 people die a year from bee and wasp related stings. Copperheads are not some crazy deadly viper, but rather a very widespread and common species that causes many envenomations. That being said, there have been more serious copperhead bites than any of the snakes listed here so far. I have a feeling that this is another ranking that's going to get me in trouble, but for now, they're going right there at the top of B tier. Next up, we have our A tier snakes. These snakes have earned their reputation a little bit more than those in B tier. And while lethal bites from these snakes are rare, they aren't as surprising. At the bottom of A tier, we have the Pacific rattlesnakes. This is going to be the North and South Pacific rattlesnakes. These snakes are most often encountered along the coastlines of California and Oregon, oftentimes in very populated and heavily trafficked areas. This means that these snakes get into human conflicts from time to time. Not only that, but the Southern Pacific rattlesnake has an incredibly toxic venom. I was actually able to find at least 6 recorded deaths from these snakes in total, but there were also a lot of very serious bites, particularly from the Northern Pacific rattlesnakes, some of which even led to partial amputations. Without medical intervention, a bad bite from one of these snakes can be lethal. And since they're quite common and have a lot more serious bites, I'm putting them in the bottom of A tier. Up next is the venomous snake that I have the most personal experience with, and that's the cottonmouth, otherwise known as the water moccasin. This is the world's only subaquatic pit viper, and they have a pretty decent range here in the southeastern United States. There are 2 species currently recognized, the Florida moccasin and the northern moccasin, and their venom is much more potent than that of a copperhead. And they also get quite a bit bigger. But unlike the copperhead, rather than most of the bites being incidental, a majority of cottonmouth bites don't come from being stepped on, but rather people trying to kill the snake or trying to pick up and move a dead cottonmouth. There's a lot of myths and misconceptions about these snakes. Cottonmouths get a really bad rap for being hyper-aggressive, super athletic snakes. But let's take a look at what they actually are. Cottonmouths are very defensive compared to copperheads, and will likely gape their mouth at you, and if you get too close, they will strike at you. However, their first order of business, if they don't feel cornered, is usually just to head towards the water. I've also found cottonmouths to be a lot more intelligent than other snakes, and they're very curious. Because of this, they're more likely to approach fishermen and boats, trying to see if they can find a better place to hang out, or steal an odd fish or two, which definitely leads to some conflict. And while their body type makes them really difficult for me to deal with, that short, stocky build is definitely not that athletic. Over the last 30 years, there's only been 2 recorded deaths from the cottonmouth, and with extensive research, I've only been able to find 7 recorded deaths over the last 100 years. You could very easily put cottonmouths lower down on this list, either below the Pacific rattlesnakes or even at the top of B tier. But I think one of the most dangerous things about cottonmouths is people's lack of understanding and respect around them. Most of the bites happen from people killing or attempting to kill these snakes. And I think that the panic that people have around these snakes just makes it worse. So until y'all all start behaving right around these snakes, they have to go right here in A tier. And at the top of A tier, we have a snake that many of you might have thought was first, and that's the Mojave rattlesnake. This is the most toxic rattlesnake in the US by far, and maybe even in the world, with a high venom yield, high venom potency, and are very capable of delivering it. In fact, a good Mojave bite has enough venom to kill multiple people. If we're talking about just the bite alone, it's one of the worst snake bites in the US. Mojave rattlesnakes also have different venom types that can lead to a lot of different bad symptoms depending on where the snake is from. Despite all of this, people just don't get bit by this snake that often. In total, I was able to find 9 fatalities attributed to the Mojave rattlesnake over the last 100 years, with a really decent handful of serious bites that needed medical attention. Let that sink in. The most toxic rattlesnake ever, a notorious killer, has not even taken 10 lives. Close to 20 people a year die from lightning strikes, and that's twice as many people as have been killed by the Mojave rattlesnake. Even though their bites are rare, this snake deserves a lot of respect. Their venom packs a punch, and is most certainly one of the worst bites you can take in the US. And for that reason, they're going into the top of A tier. Now before we get into our S tier snakes, I wanted to throw in some honorable mentions, and that being the exotic snake species. Exotic snake bites have actually killed more people than a lot of the snakes that we've covered so far. It just goes to show you that the US is actually pretty safe as far as venomous snakes are concerned. Cobras, particularly monocled cobras, Egyptian cobras, and king cobras, have all claimed a couple of lives. Gaboon vipers and rhinoceros vipers are the snakes with the largest fangs in the world, and they've also claimed a couple of people. And of course, what I would consider to be one of the world's most dangerous snakes, the black mamba, has in fact claimed a couple of lives. It just goes to show that playing with venomous snakes is never a good idea, no matter how experienced you are. And the more you interact with these animals in an inappropriate way, the more likely you are to get bit. And finally, we have made it to S tier. These are the snakes that not only boast a super toxic venom and have a very capable bite, but if you hear about a potentially fatal snake bite in the US, chances are it is going to be one of these snakes. Coming in at the bottom of S tier, we actually have the timber rattlesnake, probably the most well-known rattlesnake throughout American history. It's also the rattlesnake that I have the most personal experience working with. Because of its large range in the eastern United States, we actually have a much longer history of bites, ranging all the way back to the 1600s. Timber rattlesnakes, also called canebrake rattlesnakes in the south, can get up to 6 feet in length and oftentimes pack some super toxic venom. And much like Mojaves, they do have different venom types. But most of the bites and subsequent deaths from the timber rattlesnake are actually from Appalachian snake churches, a cultish sect of Pentecostal Christianity that often handles these snakes, gets bit, and refuses medical attention. But if we ignore those deaths, which would put the count well above 40, we have about 15 well-recorded fatalities from timber rattlesnake bites. Most timber rattlesnake bites happen because the snake was either stepped on or someone was actively disturbing the animal. And there's also been quite a few researchers that have lost their lives to these snakes as well. If the old motto of "don't tread on me" was followed, these snakes would definitely be much lower down on this list. But since they have a long history with humans, and we do have good records of the fatalities, the timber rattlesnake lands itself at the bottom of S tier. We are now down to our last two snakes. One is the icon of the West, the most successful and widespread rattlesnake species, and the other is actually the world's largest rattlesnake, with one of the most lethal bites in the US. The western diamondback and the eastern diamondback both make S tier, but deciding which one takes first place is actually really hard. So first, let's talk about the western diamondback. These snakes have a massive range, toxic venom, and run into conflicts with people in the Southwest more than any other snake. Their attitude is pretty typical when compared to other western species, but they are much more athletic, which makes them capable of a pretty decent strike. Their camouflage is also incredible for both deserts and grasslands, which makes them pretty difficult to spot, and they oftentimes do get stepped on, especially since there's so many of them. Now taking a look at the eastern diamondback, these snakes have a much smaller range than their cousins out west, a way higher venom yield, and they run into conflicts with people a lot less frequently. But the eastern diamondback rattlesnake has the highest fatality rate of any snake bite in the US, landing between 10 and 20% of bites being fatal. These snakes, in my opinion, are some of the most impressive and intimidating snakes that we have here in the US. They're my all-time favorite rattlesnake species, and they warrant a ton of respect and distance even from people that are very experienced with these animals. Without a doubt, these two snakes make up a majority of the snake fatalities here in the US. Totaling 95% of the known snake fatalities in some studies. And while medical professionals have run the numbers, I actually went ahead and counted them. And what I found is that it is incredibly close. But our winner is still the eastern diamondback. There's not a doubt in my mind that western diamondbacks are responsible for more potentially lethal bites in the US, but the eastern diamondback rattlesnake is much more likely to finish the job. I do believe that for most of human history, the western diamondback rattlesnake has probably caused more lethal bites in humans than eastern diamondbacks. But with increased medical treatment and resources that help people safely relocate these snakes in the Southwest, the western diamondback definitely loses its edge as the deadliest snake in the US. And an important thing to remember, these snakes have no interest in interacting with us. Their venom is strictly made for their prey, and the rattle on our top 3 most deadly snakes in the US is to warn us that they're there. They definitely don't want to interact with us, they just simply want to get away. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, consider subscribing, and make sure to check out the time that we got up close with North America's most venomous snake, the eastern coral snake. Let us know if you guys enjoyed this video, and we might do another one just like it in the future. That's all for now, and we will see you guys next time.